So when we talk about lists, we could just, there's so many things that we could go off of in terms of what a list is capable of. But let's go a little bit before that. What is a list? So let's say, for an example, you need to go to the grocery store. So you write out a list of items you have to buy. So on that list, you could have eggs, milk, bread, strawberries, honey, napkins, and you just go on and on about like the things that you need to buy. So this kind of list is exactly what we're talking about, like the list that you guys talk about in everyday life. Like, let's say you have a to-do list, or if you just have a grocery list, or you just have a list of things. That's exactly what it is in Python as well. A list specifically is an ordered collection of items. So another word for a list that you guys might have heard of is an array. An array. So is that an array and a list? They're not necessarily interchangeable, but they have a lot of similarities. So you'll hear some people call it a list. You'll hear some people call it an array. You might even hear someone call it an array list. So it's going to vary person to person. In Python, we call it a list, however. If you're in Java, you'll hear array and array list, but it's just going to be different. So let's go over, dissect this a little bit more actually. When we say ordered, that means order matters. So if I have a list of eggs, milk, and bread.
We can't see the screen right now. It's just a white rectangle. It was showing, okay, now it worked, but now we can see it.
How about now?
No, just a rectangle. But we can see it now.
Okay, all right. That's weird, okay, thank you. How about now? Is it still, hold on a second, let me open the chat box. Is it okay now? Is everyone okay? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Sorry, I didn't have the chat box open either. It should be all good now. So we have, so if you have an order, so a list and an ordered collection of items, dissecting this a little bit further, ordered just means that if you have something like eggs, milk, and bread, this is not the same as milk, bread, and eggs. Order matters. So these two are not interchangeable. These are two different things. So order matters. A collection just means that it could be more than one thing. You could have 0 things, you could have 1 thing, or you could have multiple things. Items just means just whatever you're storing, whatever you're taking a look at. So an ordered collection of items, it could be numbers, it could be strings, it could be booleans, you could have different kinds of things going on here. So why do we need lists? Why are lists so helpful for us? So in the context of, or let me just give an example. So let's say I want to keep track of 160 students and their scores on an exam. And I want to do this in a computer program. If I were to write student 1 equals 90, meaning student 1 has a score of 90, or student 2 is equal to 85, student 3 is equal to 70. If I have to type this out 160 times for each student, all the way to the point where I get to student 159 is equal to, like, I don't know, like 78. And then student 160 is equal to like 95. It's a lot of work, very painful, and it's just something I wouldn't recommend. So what we can do instead is create a single collection, a single list that represents the scores of all students. We can make a single collection of all students and keep track of all of their grades. So instead of saying student 1 is equal to 90, student 2 is equal to 85, student 3 is equal to 70, we could say this one right here is for student number 1. This one right here is for student number 2. And this one right here is for student number 3. And instead of writing out 160 different variables, this is all done with one variable, a single list, which is definitely going to save you a lot of time. I mean, still, this isn't the most efficient way, but then this is one way that we can do it that is better than the alternative of this. So let's start with talking about how we can make a list specifically in Python, which is similar to how you would make a list in the AP exam. So we're just going to go ahead and start with this. So there's 2 ways we can do this. You could start off with making an empty list. To make an empty list, to make an empty list, you can just start off with brackets. So brackets represent a list or the collection of things. So if you just have an empty, like nothing inside of it, that means there's nothing inside of it. Or you can instantiate it like this. However, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to be using this one up here. If there's already things inside of your list, if you already know what belongs in your list, then you can create an already initialized list by, instead of using empty brackets, you can place things inside of your brackets. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Notice that all of these do not have to be the same data type in Python. However, if you're using C++ or Java, they all should be the same data type. They should all be integers, they should all be doubles, they should all be strings, they should all be a certain object in the case you're using these. However, that's not the case for Python. Python can be you can have a wide variety of things in each list. Or you can initialize it like this. But once again, I'm going to opt for using this one on top. So let's go ahead and see what this list will look like in just an example. Can everyone see this? Okay, perfect. So to make a list, we can make an empty list by just using regular brackets. We could also make a non-empty list, so a initialized list by using brackets, but with things inside of it. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's start off with making an empty. I'm going to call this empty list. So if I actually print out this empty list, you can see that there's just nothing inside of it. It's just an empty list. It's quite literally just a list with nothing inside of it. That's why we have a bracket with nothing inside, or a set of brackets with nothing inside. However, if I have something that's initialized with things, so I decide to use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I print this out, you can see that I have my list with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Don't worry, we are going to be doing a little bit more with this, but this is just how you create a list. So now let's go with, let's talk about more operations that you can do with lists. So you could have a little bit more flexibility, not just work with an array that a list that you create or by hard coding. So if you want to access a specific thing in a list, you want to use brackets, kind of like every other, just like strings, it's exactly the same thing. You use brackets to indicate what exactly you want access to. Also, I hope you guys keep in mind that the index starts at 0. Index starts at 0 in Python and every other language, but index will start at 1 if AP Computer Science Principles exam. So for now, we'll just only focus on this right here, the top one, where the index is 0, but later on we can make that transition later. So let's say I have a list that looks like this. So let's say that this is list L. So at index number 0, I have a string ABC. Index number 1 is ONE, like a string 1. I have 32 as integer, a float of 12.5, a boolean of true, and then I have like a whole bunch of other things that are still in my list. So, oh, actually, I think I remember I call this list name. Oops. List name equal to. So what value or values would I get when you call list name 4? What would that give me? Anyone? Just like strings. True. Very good. It will give you true. Because you can see that the 4th index is true. So if you do the next one, list name 10, what would that be? Is there a 10? There's no 10, right? So this would give you an error. This would give you an error. It unfortunately would not give you a value, unless you consider an error a value, but you should not. Never settle for an error. What if I give you list name 7? What would that give you guys? Very good, comp. I'm gonna give you comp because that's the 7th index. What if I have one more, list name 0? What would that be? Very good, it would be ABC. So it's all about the brackets. It's just like the strings. If you want to access a specific character, we use brackets and we place an index number inside of the brackets in order to get a specific character. But instead of getting just a character, we're not limited to one character. We are now allowed to get a specific value that is inside of our list. So next slide, if it lets me. Another special characteristic about Python lists is that it is dynamic. It's not static. This could be both a blessing, but it could also be a curse, but normally I would say it's a blessing. So talking about what each of these mean, static. Static means it's fixed in memory size. Which means that once you create it, you cannot add onto that list, nor can you remove anything from that list. Dynamic is the opposite of that, which means it is not fixed, which also implies that you can modify it. So if you want to add something onto it, feel free to do so. But there are some things in Python, or like there are some other kinds of lists, or I guess they're not really lists. There are other data structures in different coding languages and also in Python where it's static, where you cannot modify it. What you have is like what you create is what you have. List is not like that. You can add things onto it, and this is one way you could do it. Dot append. If you wanted to add something onto the end of the list, you could use dot append. So dot append and whatever you want to add onto it. But notice that this is onto the end of the list. So not inserting it into a specific location of the list, it is adding it to the end of the list. But if you want to insert it into a specific location, you can use dot insert. So dot insert, you do have to have an additional argument. You use, like, of course, like whatever you want to add, but also you have to indicate where you want to add it. So let's go ahead and work with this a little bit. Let's see firsthand what it will do. So right now we have an empty list. You can see that this is an empty list. I want to add empty, or we want to add this smiley face. Oops. Everyone can see this, right? So we want to add in a smiley face to that list. That's going to be the first thing. What function do I use? I introduced two functions to you. The first one is dot append, and the other one is dot insert. Which one do we want to use if we just want to add in a smiley face? Append, very good. So we could do empty dot append and then the smiley face. You always want to use the list name here. So it's always going to be the list name dot append, and then the thing you want to append, the thing you want to append. So now if I run this, you can see that I have a smiley face right here inside of my list. So the empty list, well, we created an empty list, is no longer empty because something has been added into it. Let's say after this smiley face, I also want to add the number 9 to the end. What line of code should I put in right here to add the number 9? So very good. It's going to be empty dot append, and then the thing you want to append. Whoops. So empty is the list name dot append, because that's the function, and then the thing you want to append, which is 9. So you can see that if we print out our list, it is empty, or it's a smiley face, and then after that is the number 9 because we added the number 9 to the very end. Sorry, having issues right now with my mouse. Okay. What if this time I want to add hi in the very front of the list? Do I want to use dot append this time? No, right? I don't want to use append this time because remember, this is to add onto the end of the list, whereas .insert is to insert or add in a specific location in the list. And to use the insert function, you use list name .insert, and then you always use the index first, so where you want to insert it, and then also the thing that you want to insert. So in this case, if it's at the very front of the list, what index number is the very front? 0, very good. So it's going to be empty dot insert 0 because that's where we want to insert it, and then high because that is what we want to insert. So you can see now high is inserted at the very front and everything else has been pushed back. So it does not replace, it pushes everything else back. So if I want to insert high after high, I would do empty.insert. Where would I insert it this time though? Very good. It would be an index number 1 because that is right after index 0. Index 0 is the very first thing in the list. So insert 1, comma, by. So you can see hi, by, smiley face, and then the number 9. And then we could also see us do it in a list that's already been initialized for us. Let's say I want to add 6 to the very end of filled. What function would I use and how would you implement that? Very good. It would be filled dot append and then the number 6 because you're adding it to the very end of the list. So if you run it, we don't have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 now because 6 is being added to the very end of the list. What would print if I did filled dot insert 2.5, oh, sorry, not 2.5, 2, comma 2.5. So if I were to run this, I don't need you guys to write it down, but if we were to run this, you can see that it puts 2.5 in here in the second index. So we have index number 0, index number 1, and then index number 2 is 2.5 because that's been inserted. Everything else, the 3, 4, 5, and then also the 6, which we appended, will be pushed back. So this is what our list will look like. Okay. So, okay, we talked about this, we talked about this. All right, so let's do a little bit more practice. I know we just talked about this before, but what would happen if, let's call this list name. What happens if we do list name dot append 102? What should happen here? Any suggestions? right? So we would insert something at the very end or add it to the very end. So we would have 102 here now. So that would create an additional position, 10, and the number 102 will be there. Using this now, what if I have this? So what would happen is that I would insert at position 5, false. Everything gets pushed back 1. Everything after it gets pushed back 1. So this will be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then 11. So that's literally, it's just literally inserted in the position that we intended to add it. So we have some other handy operations, which we're going to cover, and we're also going to just try to we play around with them. So the first one is length. So we talked about length, like finding the length of a string. This does the same exact thing in the list. Rather than telling you the number of characters, however, it will tell you the number of elements inside of a list. So it's like the same thing though. It's very similar. To remove an element from the end of the list, you could use .pop. So it'll pop it from the end of the list. However, if you don't want to pop it from the end of the list, you do have to include an index number. So if you don't include an index number, it'll automatically assume that you want the last thing removed. But if that's not the case, use the index number. Python can also remove by using the function remove, but the function remove is not based on the index number, rather it's based off of a specific element, a specific thing that you want to remove. So there is a distinction between this and this. One is based off of the index number, so the position, and then one is based off of the actual element itself. So we'll play around with all these functions, the length, .pop, and .remove. Everyone can see this, okay? Okay. So let's just play around a little bit more with this. First of all, let's talk about to get the length of, or get the number of elements in a list. You can just go ahead and use the length of the list. So at this point, empty has 4 things inside of it. That's what we last left off with. So to prove that we have 4 things inside of it, we could also print out the length of the list. And then if we run it, we can see that the number of things in the list empty is indeed 4. We could also do this with this right here. There are how many things inside of it now? Like 7, 2, 4, 6, 7. Yeah. So there's 7 things inside of filled. And just to show that, we can do number of things in filled. And we can print out the length of filled. And you can see that it is indeed 7. Another function that we had just talked about after list was .pop. So .pop will remove something from the list. So if you use .pop without an index, so without anything inside the parentheses, without an argument, then it'll remove the very last thing from the list. So when you just use it like this will remove the last thing in the list. Just .pop. nothing else, just dot pop. So let's go ahead and observe that right here. I have, if I keep going from where I left off, which is print empty with the 4 things inside of it, and I decide to do empty dot pop. If I also observe the number of things inside, or like what is inside of empty at this point by doing print empty, and you know what, let's also do this. Let's also see how many things are inside of empty as well. And then we could also do our empty dot pop. So if I go ahead and run this, this is what happens. So the first 2 things that print is before we do the pop, before we remove from the end of the list. So I have hi, bye, smiley face, and 9, and there are 4 things inside of my list. However, after I do dot pop and I print out empty again, and I also print out the number of things that are inside of empty, we get this. Hi, bye, and smiley face. There's no more 9 anymore because it's been removed. And also you can see that the number of things in empty is now 3. So dot pop will remove from the remove 9 because it is the last thing in the list. If you decide to add something inside of dot pop, so instead of just doing list name dot pop, if you add a number inside of the parentheses, then what it will do, it will remove the value at that particular index. So maybe instead of writing a number sign, I should actually write index. So it will remove the elements at this index. So at the moment, all right, we're going to use this right here. At the moment, we have, for fields, we have 1, 2, 2.5, 3, 4, 5, and 6. I want to get rid of the 2.5, which is at index 2. So to get rid of it from index 2, I will do fill.pop 2. I don't do fill.pop 2.5. I do fill.pop 2, which is the index number. So now if I print out what filled looks like, and also print out how many things are inside of filled, we can see that before, this is my before and this is my after. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because that 2.5 has been popped out of the list. 2.5 was residing in index number 2, but because we do fill.pop 2, it's gone. It's out of the list. And we can also see that the number of things that are in the list has been reduced by 1. It used to be 7, now it's been 6 because it is one of the elements got popped out. The last function we talked about was remove. So to remove, another one that you could use is list name dot remove, but instead of using an index, you use an actual value, or the element. I will say value. So the value of the element, or remove the element with this value. So let's go here. I want to remove the happy face. Actually, no, I want to remove bye. I want to remove this bye. So if you want to remove bye, you just say that you want to remove bye. So you do empty dot remove bye. And if we want to see what it looks like, I'm just going to copy and paste this again. So the first time, this is what it looked like. Then after that, we popped 9 from the list. We popped it because, or by just using .pop with nothing inside of it, because this implies but you want the last thing from the list gone. Then after that, we did empty.remove by. So it just removes by from your list. So instead of hi by happy face, you just have hi and the happy face. And then you could also see that there's been a reduction in the number of things in the list every single time we remove something from the list, which makes sense. Does anyone have any questions so far? So far, oops. These are all of the functions that we talked about. How to make an empty list, how to make a list with things already initialized in it, how to add on to the end of the list, how to get a specific location, or sorry, how to add something into the list, how to get the number of elements in the list, and how to remove from the list. And we talked about 3 different functions to remove something from the list as well. Let's keep going with our discussion about lists. And we finished this. So let's talk about this. So we're going to do an example together in the last like 20 so minutes. Ask the user for 10 numbers. You will be inserting these numbers into an originally empty list called input list. If the number is positive, append it to the end of the list. If the number is negative, append it to the beginning of the list. After you ask for 10 numbers, ask for one more number. If that number can represent an index in your list, then print out the value from the index. If the number would make an out of bounds reference, then print out an error message. So it's a lot that I'm asking for here, but this will cover almost everything that we have talked about. So let's go ahead and just start coding this right away. And I will be asking you guys questions. So hopefully this is a little bit more engaging than what I'm used to from you guys. So going back to this. Okay, we're just copy and paste what we're looking for. Oops. So this is what or pretty much what we need to be doing. So first things first, we need to ask the user for 10 numbers. If you're asking the user if you're asking the user to do something 10 times, if you're doing the same thing 10 times, what does that imply that you need here? A loop, very good. You guys are going to be needing a loop. So this loop is going to so if you're doing a loop 10 times, should we use a for loop, a while loop, or a for each loop? What would you want to use for this right here? If you already know the set number of things that you're, or like the set number in which you need to repeat something, which is the most convenient thing to use? A for loop, right? So we can do for, we'll call ask in range 10, because we're gonna ask 10 times. So we're gonna ask literally just 10 times. You will be inserting these numbers into an original, okay, so first of all, we have to ask the user for 10 numbers. So we're going to ask, we're gonna get the input. So we'll call it user input is equal to input, give me a number. Is this, yeah, we'll just leave it like this for now. So we're just going to ask them, give me a number. We're starting to use the input, but we want to take it a step further by inserting the number into an originally empty list called input list. Question, where do I put input list? Where do I create input list? Outside the for loop, exactly. Why does anyone know why I want to do outside the for loop? You know what, you guys are probably not going to answer. So the reason I want to do it outside the for loop is because if it's inside the for loop, then you will accidentally reset your input list. So you see how input list is an empty set of brackets? If this was not out here and if it was inside of the for loop, then every single time you go through the for loop, you will reset input list. Input list will be equal to empty brackets. The next time you go in the for loop, input list will be equal to an empty set of brackets. Next time you go in through the loop, input list will reset to an empty set of brackets. So you don't want it to put it, you don't want to put it, I can't talk. You can't put it inside of the for loop. Otherwise, you are going to reset it every single time your for loop runs, which is something that you do not want to do. You want to maintain and keep track of all of the inputs. Now, if the number is positive, append it to the end of the list. How do I check if a number is positive and if a number is negative? Oh, I didn't think about 0. We'll change this to else. How do you check if a number is positive? So if the number is greater than 0, however, what's the issue here? Would that work if I tried to check if a number is, if the user input is greater than 0? What is my issue? Right. Right now, whatever we input, whatever user input will be taken in as a string, not as a number. So we have to convert it into a number. We'll make it into a float, actually. So we'll make it into something like even a decimal number should be okay. So a decimal number or a whole number, positive, negative. Now we have something that can be interpreted as a number and not as a string. Now we can compare if user input is greater than 0, then I want to append it to the end of the list. How do I append to an end of the list? So start off with, where am I appending it to? I'm going to append it onto input list. And then think about, what function do we use? Do we use append or do we use insert? Good, we use append because it's to the very end of the list. And when you use append, it will automatically be added to the end of the list. And the thing that I want to append is user input. Therefore, I'm just going to use, if user input is greater than 0, then I'm going to take user list and append user input onto it. Otherwise, we want to append it to the beginning of the list. So insert it at the beginning of the list. So same ground rules pretty much, but what function do I want to use to add it to the very front of the list? Very good. We're going to use insert. What index do I want to insert it at? We're going to insert it at position 0, and we are going to use user input. So after all of this, we are at this point right now. After you ask for the 10 numbers, ask for one more number. So since this is after we ask for all 10 numbers, this means it's outside of the for loop. So let me actually just comment things out. So remember asking 10 times, which is the reason why we have this. Here we have to convert the input into a float so we can do math. This right here is checking if the number is positive, because if it is positive, we add to the end of the list. And if it's not positive, then we insert it to the beginning of the list. Now what we want to do is ask for one additional number. So this right here is going to represent an index, potentially represent an index. So get one more user input. So the index is equal to input, give me one more number. Is this okay? If I want this to represent an index, is this okay if I just say, give me one more number? Am I missing anything here? We need to convert it. So remember, this is a string. When you want to access a very specific index, it should be an integer. So we do need to convert it, and we're going to convert it into an integer. That way we can actually use it to find or to access a specific index. So ask for one more number if that number can represent an index in your list. So this is going to require some thought. I asked for 10 total things. What is the largest index that I can use for my list then? What would be my very last index for the list? Very good. The very last index would be 9. If I have 10 things in my list and I start from the 0th index, then I have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 10 total things, but the last index would be 9. What is the smallest index that I can have? Good. The smallest index would be 0, because 0 is the first index. It's the very first index. It represents the very beginning of your list. So if I want to check that the number that they gave to me is not out of bounds, how would I do that? What would the index, what would be the requirements of the index if it were to be considered not out of bounds? So the index has to be, it's not less than 9. Okay. So the index would have to be not less than 0. So it would have to be greater than or equal to 0. That would be another way of saying that. And the index would have to be less than or equal to 9, which is another way of saying that as well. So it has to be between 0 and 9 inclusive. If it's not between 0 and 9 inclusive, then it's going to be out of bounds, because that means it will be a negative number, or it would be something 10 or more than 10. So if that is the case, then we want to print out the value from the index. How do we get something from the given the index of the list? What do we use? How do we get something from the list? Oopsies. What do we use to always grab a value from a list or even a string? What is that one thing that we use? Brackets, anyone? If you want to get a specific value given an index, so given a position, you always want to use the brackets. So we're going to print out the value that is at index. So the index being the thing that the user gave to us, and we are going to grab the value at input list or from input list. However, if it's not within the boundaries, then we just print like that or out of bounds. So this right here checks if you are within the boundaries of the list. And if it is, then you print out the value from input list at index. Otherwise, you print an error message. So let's cover this one more time by actually testing it, but I just want to print out input list here so that you guys can see like what happens. So we should be asking 10 times. So give me a number should pop up 10 times in total. And also, as we are presenting numbers, if it is a positive number, we add it to the very end of the list. If it is a negative number, then we put it in the very beginning of the list. So if I give me a number, if I write in 10, you can see 10 is just being added to the list. Front or very back of the list, we don't know because I mean, there's only one number. If I type in the number 12, it is a positive number, so we should expect it to be after 10 because it's being added to the very end of the list. And we can see it's 10 and then 12. If I put in a negative number, so -3, we should see -3 being inserted at the very beginning of the list. So it should say -3, 10, and then 12. Then if I type in, let's say another negative number, so let's say -10 this time, this should be added in at the very beginning of the list because once again, it is negative. So we can see -10, -3, 10, and 12. If I add in another positive number, let's say 99, this should be added at the very end of the list because it is a positive number. So we can see -10, -3, 10, 12, and 99. Notice that there's, notice like depending on what number we plug in or what number we are giving to the program, it is placing it as we asked it to. If it's positive, we add it to the end of the list. Otherwise, if it's negative, we insert it to the beginning of the list. So if I do like another negative number, negative 12, for example, we can see it looks like that. If I do, what happens if I put in 0? If I type in 0, would it be at the beginning of the list or would it be at the very end of the list? Beginning of the list, very good. So it's going to be at the very beginning of the list because 0 is not greater than 0. Greater is equal to, or 0 is equal to 0. So it'll be inserted at the very beginning of the list. So I'm just going to insert random numbers here. So it says, give me one more number. So at this point, we've been asked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. And it says, give me one more number. If I type in the number 7, what number is going to print out? Well, I'm going to do a poll because oh. All right. It's anonymous, don't worry. Which one will print if I type in 7? Less than half of you have voted. I promise this is the last thing we're going to do and then you guys will go. Okay, so most of you guys chose the right answer. 99. 99 will be the thing that will print. Because if we take a look at the indices, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 99 is going to be the thing that prints.